This is Studio 809.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Outdoors Hiking Bob podcast. I'm your host, Hiking Bob Falcone, and you can find me on my website at hikingbob.com, which has links to my social media, my columns at the Colorado Springs Independent, which is now back and in print. Also, my other podcasts I've done, my photography website, and you can also find a link on my website to contact me if you have any suggestions for topics or guests, or just tell me I got it all wrong or whatever. You can do all of that at hikingbob.com. Today I have an interesting guest, somebody from a completely different part of the country. If you know the podcast, we're in Colorado in the Rocky Mountains, but my guest is from the East Coast. And we share a very loose connection, being roughly the same age and having vacationed in the same spot. But the book is called Going Over the Mountain, One Woman's Journey from Follower to Solo Hiker and Back. And her name is Christine Woodside. And hi, Christine. Thank you for being on the podcast today.
Thank you for having me.
It's
Fun to be here.
It's a pleasure. And I always like talking to book authors because it's just interesting to see people's different points of view or their different experiences. So I'm looking at this, and when I got the email from your publisher, and I'm looking at this, and I get emails all the time from book publishers, and half the time they're not really relevant to the podcast. But what I liked about this subtitle, One Woman's Journey from Follower to Solo Hiker and Back, and I'm thinking to myself that there's the literal translation to that, or literal meaning to that, and then there's probably maybe a more of a metaphorical meaning to that subtitle. So tell us about just the title. Let's just start with the title. What does that mean?
Yeah, so the title, Going Over the Mountain, comes from a quotation that I have in the book. There's a chapter called Really Going Over the Mountain that begins with a somewhat obscure quotation from Henry David Thoreau. And if you live in the East and you think about mountains, we're always hearing about Thoreau. And every time you hear about some other hill, we find out Thoreau climbed that too. And he was documenting the plants. And, he sat and he was philosophizing. And so I thought this quotation was sort of silly and not true to my experience, because he was saying, we don't really do the climbing when we're there. It's after we go home that we really go over the mountain. He says we never do much climbing while we're there, but we eat our lunch very much at home, as if we're at home when we're in the mountains, which I don't agree with. I think when we're in the mountains, we're not eating our lunch as if we're at home. And then he says after we get home that we really go over the mountain. Now, you could say the whole book is sort of about that. It's about, I am not the same person I was when I began backpacking in my 20s. I'm always going over the mountain every single day in my life, whether I'm actually on a mountain or not. So in that sense, Thoreau was right. I will tell you that we originally thought we were going to title the book something very different, called The Long Way Home, which that's a phrase you hear a lot, and I don't know the original origin of it, but I got it from a Leo Kottke song. Morning is the long way home is the name of the song.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that song. And I really felt like my whole experience in the mountains was a long way of learning how to get back to who I really am and who I always was. But then we found out somebody was writing a sort of obscure, maybe somewhat obscure nature book the same year as mine, and he had titled it that. And so we decided to go with something else. So the subtitle is really we're hoping that will draw people in, because this is about me. This is my experience of the mountains. It's how I became, who I am more deeply, but I initially knew nothing about what to do. I didn't know how to take care of myself on a backpacking trip. I didn't know how to use the gear. I didn't know how to read a map. I did not know what a contour line was. I knew, absolutely nothing. But then I realized that through a through-hike of the Appalachian Trail, that was where I really had my training, so to speak. But I realized that I wanted to become like this woman I saw on my very first hike out, who was, I thought she was really old. She was probably in her 50s maybe at the time. And, she looked really wise. She had wrinkles and she was by herself doing everything. And I couldn't do that at that point. I didn't know how to do that stuff. And so that kind of stuck in my mind. And then once I got the solo hiking out of my system, kind of, I went on a bunch of solo backpacking trips and I was well into middle age by the time I decided I didn't need to do those necessarily anymore. I might, but then I sort of came back around. I'm sort of moving back around into community with people now. And I think all of us who love the mountains will agree that in the mountains, all pretentiousness disappears. We get right to it with people. You're reaching your hand out to people in the mountains. And it's just such a wonderfully honest way to see what humanity is like at its best. And that's kind of where I am, where I came around to.
So you mentioned it, like you said in the subtitle, that you were a follower first, and then you went to a solo hiker, and now you're back again. Were you a follower because that was just the best way to learn how to be a hiker, and then you decided, I don't want to be bothered? You write a lot about this group that you went hiking with, and
Yes.
there were some pretty interesting adventures and misadventures that you detail in the book. Was it that you were just like, I don't want to get involved with this, or I'd rather just be alone? Is that how you kind of made this circle from being a follower to a solo hiker, then back again to being a follower?
Well, I started out a follower because even though I had been day hiking in New England since I was a little kid, I had never been backpacking and it never had occurred to me to go backpacking. So I worked at a summer camp when I was 24. I quit my job and I fell in love with somebody. I ended up marrying him. Quit my job, went and worked at a summer camp with him. And the people we met there at the camp suggested at the end of the summer, why don't we go on this trip? And I have a chapter in the book about this trip with Peter, our friend Peter, and Kit and Phil and my husband, my future husband, Nat, and me. And I was like, you want to go? Oh, all right. All right, I'll go. That's really how I was. It was terrible. It's funny. And they handed me the gear. My husband said, here, you're going to use this pack that we found. You're going to put this in it. Here's a stuff sack. I'm like, what's a stuff sack? Why do you call it that? I was just, wow. I knew next to nothing. So that's how I was literally just following. And there's this kind of pivotal moment in that chapter where we're standing, my husband and our friend Phil are looking at a map, and the group is going to split up. Two of them want to take a shortcut. The other two want to go the long way around this, around to not have to go down the Z Cliff Trail. And I realized standing there, I didn't even know where we were. I knew we were in the White Mountains of New Hampshire, but I didn't really know anything else. I didn't know where to find us on the map, and I was so angry about that. I think I kind of took it out on them. But that kind of made me realize but I was completely transformed on that trip. I totally fell in love with the mountains on that trip. And the whole thing of, you don't have to go home the first day if you're camping. You don't even have to go home the third day, I was just, wow.
You can stay out as long as you want, basically. As long as you keep getting food and water, you can stay out as long as you want.
That's right. And yet I knew I had a lot to learn if I was going to do that, and not just depending on them,
So in the book, you talk about a number of times you hiked the Appalachian Trail, and it seems like you started, stopped, and picked it up, and you did it with this group, and then you did it again, and then you did it with your daughters in different parts, and some pretty interesting stories about people you met along the way. And one of the things I found really interesting, and I think everybody who hikes, whether you're primarily a day hiker like I am, or a backpacker like so many people who live out here and live in your part of the country and who listen to this podcast are, there were a couple of times when you came to a realization that maybe I'm not on the right track, or maybe this isn't the way to go. I'm thinking about one with your daughters where you're on top of this mountain and you're wide open space and this humongous thunderstorm just
Yes.
comes down on you. Tell us about some of those times when you've had to sit back and go, is this the right thing for me to be doing? And
Yeah, well, I mean, as you referenced, I did the entire Appalachian Trail with 3 other people, including my husband. By then, we were married, and that was a 4.5 month adventure. And then, over a period of many years, I would return often to the AT, sometimes to other trails, but very often to the AT because I loved the AT. And I would go out for a few days at a time. And when my daughters were young, when they were pretty young, like 6 and 8, I think I began taking them out on trips with just me, the all girl trips. And I had ideas of how that would go. And the very first one that I took them on, I was trying to show them Grassy Ridge, which is one of the highest points on the East Coast. It's on the Tennessee-North Carolina border. It's gorgeous, but I took them there in April, which is basically still winter in the mountains at that point. And they were so trusting, and I didn't overdo it with the mileage, and we got to the campsite fine, but then there we were totally exposed, and a thunderstorm all night long. And I was sitting there, I mean, in the middle of the night, holding the tent up with my hands because it was so windy. I was just trying to buff it, give it a buff, what do you call it? Like making a beam out of my 2 hands.
Mhm.
And I thought to myself, well, I guess we're here now. I mean, it was I would never say to myself, wow, what a mistake I made or anything like that. Maybe it would have helped if I'd said that because it took me several years before it dawned on me that if I were going to take them back to that particular spot, I needed to go in May or June, not April.
Right.
But I did think, this is so different than just being with other adults or by myself. I am with my little children and I am putting them in some danger here, and it's all up to me to keep them safe. And that was an unbelievable revelation that was very uncomfortable, a very uncomfortable realization. But it did help me grow as a person, I will say.
Prior to that, you were doing this with adults who theoretically, at least, and sometimes we find that that's not always the case, could fend for themselves if something happens. They all know what to do. But now you're dealing with these. And I was actually kind of surprised, and maybe I shouldn't be, but I was kind of surprised at how young your daughters were when you set out this trip. And I'm thinking, holy cow, these are pretty small kids, and they're going on this long trek with mom. And then the bad weather comes, and predictably the reaction is pretty much what I expected, which was like, I don't want to do this anymore. This kind of sucks. But
well,
you
they
got
never said that though. They never actually said that. And
right.
And I will say it was not super long miles that we were doing.
Right.
I would keep the mileage low
Right.
because I figured that would make them want to go back. I'm sure you've read and heard, as I have, about people taking very young children out on long trips now. And whenever I hear about that, I think, wow. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know. I can't imagine the preparation and the kind of attitude adjustment that those families are going through, but it all obviously falls in place for them because a child will not pretend
Right.
to like something. They cannot pretend. That's what we love about children. They're completely honest at that age. Now my kids, they would just get very quiet when they were worried, but they were very stoic. And I think they felt that this is what we do.
And to their credit, they went on more and more hikes with you and continued to go on as they got, we kind of follow the growth of your kids through the book as they get older and in their teens, and they're still going out there. So whatever that storm did, it didn't, as you said, didn't diminish their desire to keep going out there. I can see easily, well, half the adults I know would say, I'm never doing this again. This sucks. It rains, it's thunder and lightning. There's probably bears and mountain
Definitely.
lions and everything else out there. But your kids just stayed with that. I mean, they just
They
kept
did.
going out
And
there.
they told me many years later, as when I was working on the book, they said, we felt bad for you when things didn't work out well. And I just was so touched by that and also a little appalled that I was, I mean, I think I definitely, they could tell I really, really wanted to show them something. And I wasn't the first year we didn't get to show it to them really, because we had to retreat the next morning. I wanted get to that point that you get to in every trip where you've kind of crossed over the line a little bit and you've gotten a little bit of your stride and you start to think, I can do this.
Right.
And there isn't some boy around telling them what they perceive they ought to do, which would happen to them at school,
Sure.
But it took a while to get to that point. I really think they were almost adolescents. The last time we returned to Grassy Ridge, where I really felt that I may have gotten that lesson across to them.
Are they still out there hiking and backpacking and doing all that stuff? Or have they just decided, we did that with mom, we're done?
They are not backpacking. My younger daughter Annie was my partner in trips for years, even when she was in college. She went on a lot of trips with me, the two of us. And then she reached a point that they're now both in their 30s. So my older daughter's 35, my younger one, Annie's 33. And Annie decided at some point that she's not in a long distance hiking phase. She's not in that phase now. But Annie and her wife, Mia, will go out on adventures. So they will seek out things together. They went and saw these weird caves in Pennsylvania. They live in Pennsylvania now. Last week, when they were living in Las Vegas for 4 years, they would go on hikes out there. They would go out and find, so they do that. My daughter Elizabeth, who lives in Los Angeles now and is a nurse, she and her husband, he's not as into it as she is, but they go on day hikes. And I don't know how much you know about Los Angeles, and hiking, but it's full of these hiking trails that are threaded between neighborhoods, especially in the southern part of LA. When you get down near when you're in San Pedro and Rancho Palos Verdes. I'm probably pronouncing it wrong because I'm an Easterner, but you're hiking along these cliffs or you're going in between things, and so they do that, and they also go to climbing gyms. And I don't think my daughter Elizabeth would have tried a climbing gym if she hadn't been camping and hiking all her life. She just has this kind of adventurous DNA or something that developed there. So I'm not going to take credit for that, but I'm delighted that they can enjoy those things,
Cool. I have not spent much time in the Los Angeles area, basically passed through there, but I have hiked a little bit in Joshua Tree and over in Yosemite. Spent a little bit of time in both of those places. We have a lot of that out here too in the West, where you mentioned the other daughters in Las Vegas, so Red Rock Conservation Area, which I'm pretty familiar with, and Valley of Fire, pretty close by. A
Yes.
lot of great hiking out
I've
there, a
hiked in
lot of
both
fun to
those
do.
places now.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah. A
Yep.
lot of good time out there. And where I spent some time down in the Phoenix area, the same thing. A lot of these parks are stretched out between neighborhoods and, between parts of town, and there's trails and you can actually hike all the way across there. So I kind of know the area you're talking about. Let's talk about, and I think we're getting to a little bit about what the book is about too, how being a backpacker and a through hiker, how that worked with your personal development. You start off in the book when you're pretty young, and as you move along, and it sounds like, you're about the same age as I am, so I'm not going to say that you're older, but I never want to insult anybody by saying that. But you're still out there doing it, much like I am. I'm not much of a through hiker. I've rarely ever done that. I'm more of a day hiker. Send me out on a 8 or 10 mile day hike, and I'm happy and happy as a clam. But how was that? How did that affect your personal life and your development? Did it steal you or make you ready for the challenges of life? You talked about finding jobs and you were a journalist stuff. How did that work for you?
Well, I think there's a direct the relationship between the kind of toughness one needs during a backpacking trip or even a long day hike. You just have to understand that whatever comes at you, you need to deal with it. And that is very relevant in the rest of life. I've been a journalist my whole life, and I started being a journalist before I learned how to backpack. But I think that it helped me just persevere. I remember once being sent out to a fire. I was sent out to many fires as a journalist when I worked for a daily newspaper. Fires, emergencies, the middle of the night, some horrible thing that happened, and you're knocking on doors. And to me, it was just, I would say I'm just going to be uncomfortable for a few hours here. I need to do this right now. One of the times the fire was at a motel in Groton, Connecticut, which was near the newspaper where I was working. And everybody had been evacuated, and it was a little chilly out. And some of the people who were standing out there, they were huddled in blankets, and they just looked so miserable. And it was not even a major fire. Everything was going to be fine. They were fine. Nobody lost anything. Nobody died. They didn't lose any belongings. And I remember looking at one of the women huddling like that and thinking, I feel bad for her. And that's because I was comfortable. I would be, and sometimes I'd be outside on an icy winter night, waiting for the fire marshal, and I'm in my big Sorel boots and big, like, huge coat, and calling the story into the editor. And I remember one time saying to myself, I got to take the kids to nursery school in about it was like 4 hours from now, something like that, and you're just kind of think, oh, that's the way it is.
Mhm.
I also think these things translate directly to personal relationships. And my husband and I, we're happy just lying on a floor somewhere and eating macaroni and cheese out of a bowl. I mean, that is just fine. And I often say home is where Nat and I are in the tent. It doesn't have to be fancy. We do not have a fancy house. I do not fuss over things like that. My mother, God rest her soul, who I loved dearly, she was very particular about her appearance, and she wanted me to look a certain way. And there's a picture early on in the book where she's got me posing with a purse. I'm 3, and I just don't need that kind of stuff. And I think I often say thank God for backpacking, and camping, because it just gets you real.
Do you find, and I have found this in my life, and as some background, before I started doing this stuff, I spent almost 4 decades as a firefighter and an EMT. So that was really my
Oh, good
background.
for
This
you.
this is not what I learned how to do.
Yeah.
This is not what my education is in or anything, but I figured it out. But so I'm used to seeing a situation, figuring out how to work it, and getting past it, resolving it. And I carry that over to hiking and outdoor adventure and all the other stuff that I do, and writing and everything. Do you find that it helped you navigate any conflicts that came up in your personal life by being out there and adapting that? Did you find that you're better equipped for that than somebody who didn't necessarily have that kind of recreational background?
Well, I think it definitely helped me personally. And I think the other piece of that was my experience running track and cross country in high school, because that made me realize you have to push through pain, and then you're better. And that's the way backpacking is too. In terms of getting along with other people, you mean like coworkers, strangers, this sort of thing?
Or your significant other. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it definitely helps me with my significant other, I think, for reasons I think I touched on a moment ago, where um, we have a very simple little house. We didn't feel we needed a big house. People used to say, "You have a starter house," and I'm like, "I think this is the finisher," you know. And we just don't worry about what will people think of us if we don't join that thing, or if we don't show up dressed in this way. All that stuff. I just don't care about it at all. Um, I can't say though that backpacking is a great help with, like, say, awkward situations in work, or when you run into like you're in the airport and everybody's upset and people are all yelling at each other, and I'm not the greatest traveler that way. I need to be, sedated, I think. um, but I will say, kind of related to this, I know I have met over my years of in the mountains, I've met people who did a lot of long distance hiking, and they've gone and done maybe the Triple Crown, the CDT, and they go back and do the AT multiple times, or sometimes, and they have their reasons, and they will say, I don't feel normal unless I can go back and get back to myself out here. And I definitely get that. I mean, sometimes I get the fever and I need to go out. But I would say I really do feel like the mountains have come home with me, so that I'm able to let go of certain things in life and not obsess over them as much as I might, because I've had those experiences where I know some hikers who will say, life is driving me nuts. I'm done with it right now. I need to go out for 3 months.
Yeah.
And so I think we all react differently that way. But the short answer is, I think it does help. Definitely. I think it helps just to be a better human.
Gotcha. I tell people, and I'm not a particularly spiritual person in any way, shape, or form, but I tell people that when I'm out there on a trail, and it's either when I'm by myself, which is most of the time because of scheduling, it's just easier for me to go out whenever, as opposed to a lot of my friends who are working, have jobs, and they have schedules to keep. Uh, that I'm out there, I'm on a mountain, I'm in a place where I'm lucky enough that my cell phone's not working, I have no connection, nothing's bothering me. And I tell people, and again, like I said, I'm not a particularly spiritual person, but I'm like in my Zen space.
Hmm.
This is where everything just slows down for me, and it is what it is. Just I can't describe it, but it's just like finally I'm at peace with everything, and there's no stressors. My cell phone's not going to text me or with a message that something needs to be handled and or anything. It's just like this is my Zen space. And I'm guessing, and I'm a day hiker, I'm guessing that when you're out maybe for months, that is, I can see it going one of two ways. You either go stir crazy because you're not talking to anybody, or you're completely at peace because you're not talking to anybody.
Um, well, I mean, when we were doing the AT, I had both those experiences. I mean, of course, a lot of the long distance trails are very social places.
Right.
So even when one is a solo hiker, there are lots of opportunities to talk to other hikers, unless you are in the Alaskan bush, or, on a really remote trail, which can happen. There was a kind of weird zen-ness, or I mean, I am a faithful person. I do have, some religious faith that I follow. But when we were doing the AT, we kind of got into this thing where we would say every day, this is so hard, this is so hard, 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 hard. And then after a while, the so hard becomes a kind of, you're in the groove. You're in the groove with the so hard, and that's when we grow as people. That's when it happens, right there. There are also times when I am on some of my solo trips where I was thinking, wow, the only creature I've talked to today is a snowshoe hare. I mean, this is not normal. And I'll start to think I'm going a little bit nuts. But then that's the moment when I kind of cross over and I've grown again as a person. And I'll also just say there's something about being up above tree line for me that it's like the wind blows all the extraneous stuff out and I am more myself there. You know, this is what God wants me to be
Right.
right
Right.
there. I am God's child. I am in the deep Chrisness. Chris. So Chris, am fully Chris up there.
Gotcha. Gotcha. You talk about your two encounters with a snowshoe hare,
Yeah.
with two different snowshoe hares, and how the first one kind of startled you because you weren't expecting it. And then you saw another one some other time later, and
Right.
how the two of you just looked at each other because snowshoe hares, as you say, are notorious for avoiding people because they're prey for lynxes and other animals, and how
Absolutely. Yeah, they live in fear.
yeah, they live in fear, but then you meet one and you both kind of look at each other and you're both kind of surprised to see each other and then go your own ways. And I thought there was something there that I was trying, like, I get what you're saying. There was something kind of special about that. Then the next time you see when the kind of the same thing happens, here's an animal that does everything it can to avoid anybody, but you run
Yes.
into it and you both have this understanding that, yeah, we're both fine. We're not gonna hurt each other. I'm not out to eat the hare. The hare's not out to bother you. And
Yeah.
that moment where you spend a couple of moments just kind of looking at each other, I thought was pretty cool. That just how you explained how that felt to you. I thought that was really pretty neat part of the book.
Oh,
I
I'm
picked
glad
up
you
on
like
those.
that. Yeah, I think that wild animals are so different than human beings. They are so different. Everything is instinct with them, but they have feelings as well, you know, and you know, if I see a wild animal with children, with babies, I always feel an affinity to what they're going through because I have children, and that's weird, I know, to say. And that
Right.
moment with a snowshoe hare and I were looking at each other, um, it was kind of like for me, it was I respect you. You need to do what you need to do. I'm not going to get in your way. I really get it. You know,
Very cool. Yeah, I
yeah.
was just at a state park here today. I volunteer and I'm on the board of directors, one of the state parks here, and was hiking the trail before I went to a meeting, and here was a flock of wild turkeys, which are not uncommon at that park at all. But there was
Mhm.
like five or six adults and probably a dozen little babies, and it was
Oh, yeah.
just fun. And it was in tall grass. I whipped out my camera. I always carry a camera, and I'm trying to take pictures of them. And I got these big turkeys, and you just see the little heads of these little turkeys, and you're
Oh,
just looking
yeah.
at them, and the looking at me, and I'm looking at them. And I made a point when I saw them to be very quiet and stay in the shadow, so I wasn't scaring them. And I was wearing green, and I was just kind of working. And it was just I get that feeling that you had,
Yeah.
and I can pick up where that maternal feeling would be was they're watching their little babies, they're watching me, I'm watching them, and we're all coming to this kind of understanding. You guys are going to be fine. I'm not going to bother you. And they're
That's
looking at me going, yeah, I think he's okay, kind of a thing. It was
right.
just it was
Right.
kind of cool to run into that.
It
Um,
is.
and I really liked how you described it in the book with these two encounters with these snowshoe hares because it was very a pretty for me. I don't know why it stuck out, but for some reason those two things. It's probably the last thing you probably figure would stick out to somebody, but it was like they really stuck out to me when I read those chapters or
Well, I'm
those two passages.
glad to hear that.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about the practical. You've been doing this for a long time.
Yeah.
Um, when was the last time you did a long through hike, like on the AT or something? Has it been a little while, or have you done one more recently?
So what do you call a long through hike?
Well, a couple of days or a week or whatever, however you would describe it.
Yeah. Well, two summers ago, we went up to the Cohos Trail, which is spelled Cohos, and it's in northern New Hampshire, and it is a new long distance trail that is the Cohos Trail is today where the AT was in the 60s, where there were volunteers stringing together pieces of existing trail, creating the signage. There's a brand new trail book, just a few years old, and so this is a trail that doesn't get a lot of traffic really. And so my friend Martha and my husband Nat and I went up, and we were. It was not a super long trip. I think we did under 30 miles, but we were out for a few nights. And we were up way up north where the Connecticut River is just forming. There's a series of 4 lakes. So that's the most recent one. Last year, I had surgery because I had stage 0 melanoma on my right cheek.
Oh my.
Unbelievable. And, I had like a hole in my head for 3 months. And so I did not do anything overly vigorous last summer because they told me not to. I think now if I could go back and relive last summer, I would ignore them and go out anyway. But yeah, and we're going to go in a week and a half, we're going up to the White Mountains for 2 nights out.
Awesome.
We're going to go up to Ethan Pond and over to Guyot.
Cool. So I asked you that for a reason. I'm glad you got over the melanoma and you caught it at stage 0, which is great. That's
can't
good
even
to hear.
see it. You can't even see it anymore.
I don't see anything, which is awesome. And good for you for finding that early. I guess, and where I'm going with this was you started this, in your 20s.
Yeah.
Or actually, I think even earlier than that. And what do you find, or have you found that the people who you encounter on these long hikes, are they fundamentally different than the type of people you ran into early on? Has there been a change, or are they same when you get down to the brass tacks, are they the same kind of people they were 20, 30 years ago?
I feel that there's still great people. We run into great people out hiking. The hiking experience has changed a fair amount because of technology.
Mhm.
And so I love being around people of all ages. I love it when all ages are together because I think if I didn't hang out with, and I also teach undergraduates now these days, and when you hang out with younger people who are totally comfortable with technology, to them it's like, that's just that, It's kind of the way we were with telephones versus our grandparents,
Okay.
Like when I was a kid and we're on the phone all the time and the grandparents would be like, I never had that. What the heck? And I'm like, what's the big deal? So I do think that there's too much technology out there that I think is getting in the way of really being away when you're in the wilderness. But I think that those hikers who are using technology, they don't think it's getting in the way. And so that's helping me to be of my time. I want to still be of my time. So yes, I think people who love to go out in the mountains they're totally great people. Occasionally we run into duds, right? And sometimes that happens. But most of them are just absolutely fantastic people who are, I look at on a mountain, when I'm on a mountain and I look at people going up it, I say, everyone's out here for a reason. There's a very specific reason. They went to great trouble to get themselves out here. I'd love to know all those stories, and they need it for some reason. We all need it. So that hasn't changed at all.
Cool. And that's what I was wondering about, because technology obviously is the obvious thing. I mean, I'm sitting here with my GPS, which I was just using today, and I carry a beacon and I have a cell phone, and I'm for somebody my age, I think I'm way ahead technology wise, but I was always like that as growing up. And my dad was an electronics guru, and he played with all that kind of stuff. So I think I inherited that from him. But it's good to hear that other than the technology, the people, if I'm getting what you're saying, the people are still basically the same. They have different gadgets. I'm like you. I remember the landline phone with the 20-foot coiled cord to go into a room and shut the door and talk to somebody kind of privately, which, people nowadays are like, what's a landline phone, or why'd you have a 20-foot cord? Kind of a thing.
Right.
Because we didn't have wireless phones at the time.
No, we didn't.
Yeah, but it's good to hear that the people you're encountering, the people who are taking it upon themselves to go do these long hikes, are the same kind of people, other than technology, as when you started out, which is, to me, is very refreshing to hear that. I think we think in our minds that, you know, technology makes people bad. I don't think that's the case at all. But I
It
like
can be
hearing,
distracting,
yeah,
technology can be distracting, but so could leaving lots of notes for people on trees, which is what we used to do long ago. That too can be distracting. I look sometimes at social media and through hikers are chronicling everything they're doing as it's happening, which we couldn't do way back when I was in my 20s. That didn't exist. And I'm glad that I had an experience where I wasn't doing a chronicle on social media, but on the other hand, they're probably not thinking that it's a huge deal. It's just a
right.
way to stay in touch with people, right? And so I try to learn from that. The other interesting thing going on today is the speed records. There are a lot of people trying to challenge themselves and others, be competitive and a little bit. And I think most people have a really great attitude about that. But I personally am glad that I could kind of slow hike, a little slower. Um, yeah.
It's interesting you talk about chronicling, because I guess back in the day, you did chronicle, but you wrote it in a diary.
Yeah.
And it wasn't instant gratification, that you wrote it in a diary and you may or may not have shared it with anybody, but you were still chronicling it. Now it's the instant gratification, not only that it's instantly out there, but there's this compulsion to share it with everybody. You're going to put this out there, and your 20 followers or 300 followers or 3 million followers are going to read what you're putting out there. I think sometimes it's kind of nice that back in the day you wrote it down and you had time to think about it before you said, I'm going to share this with people, or I'm not going to share this with people. And, great books have been written based on the diaries people kept when they were doing some of these things.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
probably a lot of people, it's probably better that they didn't share their experiences for whatever reason. It's probably this mixed bag. So but I think it's just the manner in which we're doing it, the manner in which we're chronicling what we're doing is just a
Yeah.
little different.
It
I'm
is.
sure
And back in the day, before social media, before iPhones, people were leaving notes for each other in notebooks that were left in shelters on the Appalachian Trail and probably on some of the other long distance trails. And some of those notes they left were unvarnished and a little silly, and you're just like you're punch drunk and you've been hiking for 25 miles and you're like, and so that was like the social media back then. Yeah.
and we still see that out here with the logs at the summits. That
Mhm.
there's always a summit log, and people will write notes in there. And most of the time, it's just like I write my name and the date, and I leave it at that. But sometimes people write a little bit longer note, like
Oh yeah.
boy, this really sucked," or "I'm never hiking with Steve again," or something like that. Like, "You drug me up here for what?" It's interesting reading those, and those typically don't get shared, but it's fun to. I think the fun part of that is the only way I got to see that was to experience what they experienced, was to climb up that mountain and
Yeah.
to read it. And I think that that's actually kind of fun, that this didn't make it on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter or whatever, but it's in this book and I got a chance to actually look at it and read. But this person can't stand their friend Steve anymore, and they're either hiking back down with him or they're going to push him off a cliff because it's such a miserable experience. Or they had a great time. They saw something spectacular on the way up, or either way, it's kind of interesting to see that. Uh,
Yes.
I'm imagining too, and getting to the practical part of this, that the equipment we're using now is a whole lot better than back in the day. Because I know back in the day when you started this, these were the days of the external frame backpacks. I remember, and to be honest with you, they were terrible. I don't think anybody's using anything with an external frame anymore unless they found it at a garage sale or something. But I imagine at the very least, besides the electronics, the gear itself is just going to be a whole lot better than it was back in the day.
Yeah, it has improved. I I imagine if I were a real gear hound, I could today have a super lightweight everything. And I haven't gotten too obsessive about that, which I think maybe I could get more into it. But the packs are better. The water filter systems are so much better and not as heavy. Those are the two hugely better things. The tents are better designed and not as heavy. Yeah, those things mainly. When we were hiking the AT, my husband had a North Face external frame pack that looked like, it looked like a bad pool ladder, really. I mean, just-
I love that description.
he once he once acted out like he was in a boxing ring getting ready to put this thing on his back, and he said, "In this corner we have El Norte," referring to the North Face pack, and then he referred to himself as the skinny wimp from New York, which was, I mean, we're just like dying, and because you'd have to pull this thing on. I had an internal frame pack though back then. I started out with a Caramore, which was a British company that I'd bought when I was in London, and that thing was just like a nylon sausage. I didn't like it very much. And then 600 miles in, I bought, I think it was made by North Face. It was an internal frame pack that I thought was like the best thing ever, and it was okay. Uh, so that helped me not have back pain. But the packs are so much better, so much better.
I had an internal frame pack, and I don't even remember what brand it was. I remember it was like fluorescent orange for some reason. I thought that it would save my life because it was bright orange and people could find me. All they could find would be my corpse if something happened, but they could find me.
Yes.
But that internal frame pack was, it was made out of, I guess what you would call like really thick coat hangers, gauge metal. So all it was thinner metal burying itself into your back as opposed to the big tubes. It's like the new stuff is so nice. I mean, I carry a backpack with my camera gear, which weighs about 20 pounds, and I've hiked 10 miles at a stretch with that. It feels great. I could not imagine doing that with an external frame pack. That I don't want to sound like the old guy says, you don't know what it was like back in the day, but I want to say that this stuff was so much better now than it is then.
Back in our day, little thing, little children. Well, and the speed records and the mileage that people are able to do today, are made possible by these improvements in gear, and so that's great because you can enjoy yourself more, and yeah.
And the technology, which keeps you abreast of changes, so you can plan for it and keep going or not go. Or you talk a couple of times about you're not sure what the weather's going to be like, so maybe we go, maybe we don't go. Now we look at our phone, and go, yeah, that thunderstorm is over here. It's going to pass over in 20 minutes, so we can go behind it or something.
I
makes it so much
know. I
different.
mean, that's incredible.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's a good thing. That's a great tool.
Yeah.
And you carrying your, your Garmin or whatever and your beacon, these things are good.
Yeah.
It's good to have those things. Yeah.
I'm a big advocate of beacons and GPSs and all that kind of stuff. But I think I've always been a little ahead of my time for technologies for somebody my age. But on the other hand, maybe I'm not. Christine, this has been a great conversation. The book is a blast. It's called Going Over the Mountain, One Woman's Journey from Follower to Solo Hiker and Back. It is by the Appalachian Mountain Club Books. And I'm guessing you could find this either online. I'll have a link to it where you could find a copy of the book. Is it available as an e-version also or just in print?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
And you can find it anywhere books are sold. Anywhere you search for books, any bookstore will order it for you. It's distributed by like a major book network. And Appalachian Mountain Club Book Department, they were fantastic to work with on this book.
It is a fun read. It's a quick read. I think it's really a lot of fun. A lot of insights in here. A lot of very funny stories. And some stuff that toward the end, there's a couple of incidents that I'm been aware of people who got lost and unfortunate things that happened. And I think in some of at least one of those cases with a woman who wasn't found for a couple of years, that technology would have saved her.
Yes.
It's something I advocate for, the technology, but it's a great book. People, if you want to read about the experiences of hiking and the through hiking and the long hike, this is a fun book to read. Christine, again, thank you so much for taking the time to appear on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
You're very welcome. I enjoyed every minute.
Awesome. And everybody, thank you for listening to the Outdoors with Hiking Bob podcast. We'll talk to you next time.